Snow pressed against the windows of Ben's small flat in Vasastan, turning Stockholm into soft shapes of white and yellow light as the afternoon slid toward evening. And he sat in his leather armchair with a wool throw over his knees while his daughter Emily and her husband Trevor stood by the mantel where family photos leaned against evergreen garland. And the room smelled of coffee and old paper, and the faint spice of a candle that someone had blown out a minute earlier, when Trevor's voice cut through the warmth and said, "Listen, old man, I know for certain Gettysburg was in '64. And the words were sharp enough to stop every small sound in the room, so that even the radiator's hiss seemed to hold its breath. And Ben placed his cup on the side table with careful hands, the ceramic clicking once on wood, and he lifted his back straight because 40 years of lecture halls had trained him to meet noise with calm. And he said in a steady voice, "It was July 1st through 3rd, 1863, and Emily said Trevor's name in a warning tone. But Trevor slapped the mantel so the frame shook and a photo of Emily at 16 tilted in its stand. And he said, "You're a stupid old man who confuses facts." And the insult landed like a cold draft under a door. And Ben felt it in his chest, but let his face stay quiet, and Emily's eyes shone with a quick wetness that she blinked away as she reached for her coat. And Trevor grabbed his black wool overcoat from the hallway hook with fast, angry motions and said, "Come on, Em, let's go somewhere with people who live in reality." And Emily hesitated, her hand on the sleeve of Ben's cardigan for a heartbeat that said she was sorry. Then she followed her husband, and the door closed softly, but the sound ran long through the flat. And after a moment, the BMW engine flared in the street, and the headlights slid along the snow on the sill. And then the car was gone down the quiet block where a tram bell clanged in the distance. And Ben stood with stiff knees and went to the window and watched the small flakes drift under the lamp as if the city were breathing slowly. And he touched the cold glass with his palm until the sting in his chest dulled. And then he turned and walked along his bookcases, knowing by habit where the burgundy spine waited on the second shelf. And he drew out the encyclopedia and opened it to the pages that always fell open by themselves and read the entry again. Not because he doubted it, but because ritual steadied him. And the dates were there in plain print, July 1 to 3rd, 1863. And he nodded once and set the book on his desk and took a notepad and wrote the date and the word turning point. And the ink looked sure against the paper, and he capped the pen and replaced it in its tray. And on the wall above the desk, the framed degrees from Uppsala. And a later parchment from a visiting year abroad looked back at him in their calm glass. And on the corner of the desk, a black and white photo showed a younger Ben in a stiff collar at a winter event with bright chandeliers. And he reached to straighten the frame but did not pick it up. And he opened the top drawer and laid his fingers on a small velvet box and then closed the drawer without opening it, because some things did not need to be touched to be true. And he went to the kitchen and rinsed his cup and started fresh coffee. Listening to the grinder's clear mechanical sound as a neighbor down the hall laughed and a door clicked, and the building resumed its ordinary life. And he poured his coffee and stood by the sink and thought of the word fool that Trevor had thrown at him, and how words can bruise without drawing blood. And he let the heat of the cup warm his hands. And he looked at the calendar pinned to the corkboard and saw there were 5 days until Julafton. And he said aloud in a quiet room, 5 days. And he returned to the living room and straightened the tilted photograph and smoothed the throw on the armchair and turned the candle's wick to center it. And he sat again and breathed in and out until his breath matched the slow winter pace outside. And the mystery, if there was one, was simple and patient, like snow finding its place. What kind of man he would choose to be when the door opened next. Morning came gray and quiet, and Ben moved through his small flat with practiced order, opening the blinds to a calm drift of snow over Vasastan and setting the kettle on while he folded last night's blanket and straightened the photo that had tilted during Trevor's outburst. At 9 o'clock, the bells from the church down the street rang clear, and as if obeying a signal, the phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. And Emily's name lit the screen. And when he answered, she spoke in a careful, cheerful voice that did not quite hide its strain. Dad, will you come on Julafton? 6 o'clock. Just family and a few of Trevor's colleagues. And Ben looked at the slow-moving snow beyond the window and said, "Of course," and asked if he should bring anything. And she said, "Just yourself," with a softness that told him the invitation was hers, not her husband's. And after they said goodbye, he stood for a long breath with the warm mug in his hands and let the plan form step by step. He took a small notebook from the drawer and wrote 3 short lines. Gift for Emily. 1 bottle of good Burgundy. Arrive early. Be kind. And then he dressed in a thick sweater and his navy coat, wrapped his scarf twice, and went out into the white morning where tires hissed on salted streets and cyclists kept their pace steady. And he walked toward Odenplan, past the bakery with saffron buns in the window and the kiosk where a man brushed snow from stacks of newspapers. And he entered the little bookshop with the bell that chimed once and asked the clerk for a biography Emily had mentioned months ago, the one on Eleanor Roosevelt. And the clerk found a fine hardback with clean print and a ribbon marker. And Ben ran a fingertip along the spine, as if checking a seam, then paid and had it wrapped in brown paper. He crossed to the wine shop with its fogged glass and listened to the owner speak about 2 vintages of Burgundy, one brighter, one deeper, and chose the bottle that would sit well with roasted meat without shouting. And the owner nodded approval and slipped it into a simple sleeve. And on the way home, Ben stopped for fika at a cafe where cups were thick and the cardamom buns came warm, and he sat by the window and made small notes on how the evening might go. Greet everyone, speak plainly, avoid argument, answer questions only when asked. And he felt a quiet resolve settle, the kind that does not show itself until needed. Back in the flat, he laid his navy suit across the bed and checked each seam, buffed his shoes until the leather caught the window light, trimmed his beard with slow, sure strokes, and set cufflinks beside his watch. Pumado. Then he opened the top drawer of his desk and touched the velvet box he rarely touched, and closed the drawer again, because he did not need objects to prove what a plain sentence could prove. And he wrapped the book again with sharper corners, tied a thin gold ribbon, slid a small card under it with a neat, "For Emily, love, Dad." And he set the wine and the gift by the door with his gloves and hat and a folded umbrella in case the weather turned wet. Afternoon slid toward the blue hour, and he ironed the shirt he would wear, each press of steam smoothing not just fabric but his thoughts. And he placed his wallet, phone, and a clean handkerchief in his inner pocket, then wrote 1 more note and tucked it with them. Keep your voice low, because he knew that tone mattered as much as facts. And as the first paper stars lit in windows across the street, he sat for a moment in his armchair and watched the snow choose its places. And he felt the small mystery of the evening ahead. Not whether he was right about dates, but whether truth spoken gently would be heard. And whether a room full of friends and colleagues would see him as he was, instead of as someone's story. And when the clock on the shelf reached 5, he stood, put on the suit that fit like history itself, gathered the gift and the wine, locked the door, and stepped into the clear, cold air, ready to meet whatever waited at Emily's table. Ben drove through the blue hour along snowy streets toward Ostermalm, the wipers tapping a steady rhythm while paper stars shone in apartment windows and the tram bell chimed at the corner. He parked carefully behind a line of cars crusted with salt, lifted the wrapped book and the Burgundy from the passenger seat, and walked up the stone steps where a wreath hung flat against the wind. Emily opened the door at once, as if she had been waiting, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "You look perfect," her eyes bright but tight at the edges. Inside, the hallway was full of boots and coats, warm from bodies and dusted with snow, and the house smelled of cloves, orange peel, and roasted meat. Ben set the wine on a sideboard and handed over the gift, and Emily touched the ribbon once with her thumb, like a thank you she could not say aloud. The living room glowed with candles and a tall tree dressed in white lights and red ribbon. And clusters of guests stood with glasses in their hands, speaking softly over the low music. Trevor's voice rose above the room like a sharp bell. "Here he is. The old man who thinks Gettysburg was in 63, he said with a grin that asked for laughter. And a few people laughed because they thought they should, while others glanced at Emily to see if this was a joke or a warning. Ben kept his shoulders square and nodded to the nearest group, said, "Good evening," and took the glass of glögg someone offered. Emily moved fast, introducing neighbors and two colleagues from the firm, trying to pull the attention back to small talk. Trevor did not let it go, leaning on the mantel as if it were a stage rail, retelling Sunday's argument with an extra flourish. Near the bookcase, a silver-haired man in a dark suit turned and studied Ben's face, the way scholars look at a photograph they think they have seen before, then stepped closer with a quick, sure smile. "Forgive me, are you Professor Bengt Anderson?" he asked in careful Swedish. Ben inclined his head. "Ben is fine," he said. The man held out his hand. "Henrik Wallen, Uppsala Economics. We served on a national committee years ago, and the handshake had that warm grip of old work shared well." The small exchange drew a ring of quiet attention, as if the room leaned in. Henrik's eyes lit. "Your seminar on war finance. Students lined the corridor for a seat," he said, amused by the memory. Emily froze for a heartbeat with a tray in her hands, then breathed again. A woman in a navy dress, Sarah from the firm, edged closer and asked, "So you taught at Uppsala?" And Ben said, "Yes, and abroad later," in the even tone he used when facts were enough. Trevor pushed a laugh into the circle. "He also moved the date of Gettysburg to suit his story," he said, but the joke fell short now. Henrik's brow folded. "Gettysburg is 1863. Everyone knows this," he answered simply, and the room lowered its volume by a degree. Someone turned the music down without being asked. Sarah's look shifted from polite to interested as she asked what Ben studied, and Henrik answered for him. "The way war shapes money and policy," his voice warm with respect. People who had been talking about ski trips and holiday trains drifted toward the bookcase, drawn by the steadier gravity there. Emily touched Trevor's sleeve once, a warning he ignored. Ben kept his hands by his sides and answered each question with short, clear lines. Where he taught, what he researched, why simple dates matter, because they hold the shape of bigger truths. The air in the room changed from party warm to watchful calm, as if the snow outside had asked the house to listen. Trevor's smile thinned and his voice grew louder to match the attention he felt slipping away. Ben did not argue, did not raise his tone, only let each plain fact sit where it belonged. Glasses paused halfway to mouths, candles guttered and steadied, the tree lights hummed, and the circle around the bookcase tightened by another step, waiting to see which story would stand when someone finally reached for a phone. Trevor lifted his phone with the certainty of a man who expected obedience from facts, and everyone around the bookcase watched the small blue screen light his face as he said, "Let's settle it now," and typed with quick, hard taps, and the room fell into that strange winter quiet where even a clock seems to hesitate. The search results appeared, and he read aloud, "Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st to 3rd, 1863. And the last number caught in his throat, so he cleared it and scrolled, naming sources like a list he hoped would change. Wikipedia, Britannica, National Park Service. But every line repeated the same date. And the circle of guests let out a low shared breath while the Christmas music was turned down without anyone saying a word. Ben stood still, hands at his sides, saying nothing because the truth did not need a second voice, and Henrik nodded once, as if closing a file that had never truly been open. Trevor swallowed, then lunged for a new ledge, typing again. Bengt Anderson Economic History, and links stacked in the glow. University pages, conference notes, a Swedish Academy citation. And then the Nobel Foundation page opened with its formal title and a photograph of the Stockholm stage, blue flowers at the platform, white tie and tails, and a younger Ben in profile with a careful smile. A guest covered her mouth. Sarah from the firm leaned closer without moving her feet. Henrik said gently, "He never leads with that," as if explaining a private habit to the room. Trevor's face changed shade by shade, and in the silence his voice sounded small when he said, "This could be mixed up. Maybe he never went to Stockholm." But Henrik answered, "We watched it on television. The king shook his hand, and the words felt solid, like a door latch sliding home." Emily stepped forward now, her voice steady and low, the kind of tone that turns a room. "Trevor, that's enough." But Trevor pressed again. "I won't be mocked in my own home," though no one was mocking him. And he reached for his coat from the hall hook with jerky hands, keys catching in the lining so they clinked sharp against the wood. Ben stayed where he was, meeting no one's eyes and everyone's at once, letting the moment settle. Emily said only, "Drive carefully." And the care in it belonged to grown people who know consequences. The front door opened, cold air cut through warm spice, and then closed with a clean click that seemed to measure the end of an argument. Outside, tires hissed on slush and a car engine moved away down the dark street. Inside, the room stayed very still, candles steady, tree lights a soft hum, guests standing in that awkward space between leaving and staying, holding glasses they had forgotten to sip. Ben turned to Emily and saw that her jaw had unclenched by a small degree, and he gave a small nod as if to say the worst part had passed. Henrik cleared his throat, not to claim victory, but to offer a path back to ordinary life, and said, "The food smells wonderful," and Mrs. Henderson added, "It would be a shame to let it cool." And the group answered by shifting a step toward the dining room with the relief of people given permission. Sarah set her glass down, looked once more at Ben as if fixing a new picture over an old one, and then helped Emily carry platters from the kitchen. Ben lifted a stack of plates without announcement, feeling their warmth in his palms, and followed the mystery of the evening. Not dates, not medals, but whether gentleness could hold a room, quietly answering itself as chairs slid back, napkins opened, and ordinary talk began to find its way through the air, again like footprints across fresh snow. They moved toward the dining room in a slow, careful line, as if crossing a narrow bridge together. And the table waited with candles, small glass stars, and plates warmed by the oven, while the smells of cloves, orange, and roasted meat settled over everything like a soft blanket. Emily lifted the crown roast with steady hands, set it down on the board, and began to carve. And people took their seats without fuss. Napkins opened, glasses filled, the scrape of chairs and the light clink of cutlery marking a return to ordinary rhythm. Ben sat midway down the table between Henrik and a woman with clear eyes and silver hair who introduced herself as Violet from the floor above. And for the first minutes, no one spoke about prizes or battles. Only potatoes, bread, and please and thank you, until the warmth of the food released the tension in shoulders and the room breathed again. Sarah from the firm was the first to step back toward the earlier subject, but she did it gently, asking, "What is the ceremony like?" And Ben described it in simple lines, the concert hall bright with winter flowers, the orchestra tuning, the long tradition of white tie, the careful walk across the stage, the handshake from the king, and then the quiet after, when applause fades and a person hears only his own breath. He kept his voice low and did not add color he did not need, and the table seemed to lean a little closer so as not to miss a word. Henrik asked about his lectures, and Ben said he liked to show how wars do not only move armies but also money and rules, and how dates are not just numbers but doors that open to larger rooms. Violet listened with a stillness that felt like respect, then said she worked with a charity that planned long budgets and wondered if his way of thinking could help them avoid old mistakes. Ben nodded and said yes, the past leaves footprints. People can measure if they want to, place their feet more safely. And Violet asked, almost shyly, if he would have coffee with her later in the week to talk it through, perhaps at the cafe on Götgatan that warms cups before pouring. And Ben said Thursday at 2 would suit. And the small plan settled between them like a folded note both would remember. Laughter rose when Henrik told a story about a conference where all microphones failed and a shy mathematician had to give a keynote by shouting like a town crier until someone found a megaphone. And the table laughed the way people laugh when they need to check that their voices still work. Emily moved easily now, topping up glasses, laying another spoon by the gravy. Touching Ben's shoulder once in passing, a silent thank you that reached deeper than words. Sarah raised her glass with a small smile and said, "To truth told gently," and the toast passed around the table without argument. Dessert came simple and warm, saffron buns and cream, and then coffee touched down in front of each person, dark and clean, and the talk softened into winter things. The market in Gamla Stan, the best place to buy candles, the way snow makes the city sound like a held breath. Coats came from hooks and were buttoned. Scarves were wrapped twice. Guests thanked Emily for the meal and nodded to Ben in that new way people use when they have updated a picture in their minds. Mrs. Henderson from next door pressed his hand between both of hers and said he had been gracious. And he answered that kindness costs less than pride, and she nodded like someone pocketing a small coin for later. The door opened and closed in quiet cycles, a small gust of cold with each goodbye, until the apartment fell back to the sound of candle wicks, whispering, and plates cooling. Ben helped Emily carry dishes to the kitchen, stacked them in neat piles, ran hot water over the sink, and together they cleared the table with the slow competence of people who have shared many kitchens. When they returned to the dining room, the tree lights hummed softly, and the empty chairs looked like a solved riddle whose answer no one needed to say aloud. And the only question that remained, what would happen next, waited politely by the window with the falling snow. When the last guest had gone, Ben and Emily stood by the window and watched the snow sift down through the cone of the streetlight, and the city outside looked calm and sure after all the noise. And Emily said quietly, "Thank you for coming," while she pressed her palm to his sleeve as if to anchor herself. And he said, "You cooked well. You carried the room." And they went back to the table together and cleared plates in steady trips to the kitchen, stacking china, running hot water, wiping the board where the crown roast had rested. And in that small shared work, the sharp edges of the evening dulled. When the counters were clean and the candles were stubs, he wrote a short note, "Proud of you, E," and slid it under the fridge magnet shaped like a star. And she saw it and gave a quick smile that looked like the first true breath after a long swim. And then he put on his coat and scarf, buttoned them carefully, checked that his gloves were in his pockets, and said he would call tomorrow. And she said she would be home and would like that. And he stepped into the hallway and felt the building's quiet settle around him. Outside, the cold took his face and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke. And he moved to the car with careful steps on packed snow, opened the door, placed his hat on the passenger seat, and started the engine, letting it warm before he pulled out. The drive along Strandvägen was slow and simple, lights from the lampposts laying a bright path on the black water and breaking and mending with each ripple. And he passed a tram whose windows held rows of tired faces going home, and he turned toward Vasastan, letting the wipers keep their small rhythm while he thought of the evening in clean lines. Insult, silence, proof, mercy, a table set right. He parked near his building, turned the wheels toward the curb, and cut the engine, then stood for a moment with the car door open to listen. The soft hiss of snow, a distant laugh from a doorway, the muffled bell of a bicycle. And he climbed the stairs, one hand on the rail, not rushing his legs, and unlocked the flat and stepped into the familiar smell of paper and soap. He hung his coat, set his keys in their dish, filled a glass with water, and walked to the desk where the top drawer held the velvet box. And he rested his hand on the wood, then left the drawer closed because nothing inside needed to be checked to remain true. He sat in the armchair and pulled the wool throw over his knees and let his back find its place. And the phone buzzed once on the table with a message from Violet. "Thursday at 2 on Götgatan, still good?" And he replied, "Yes," looking forward, and another message arrived from Emily. "Home, thank you." And he sent back a small heart and the words, "Sleep well." He turned the lamp lower and listened to the building breathe. Pipes ticking, a neighbor's cupboard door closing, the wind drawing one soft draft under the sill. And he thought about Trevor without anger, only with the plain knowledge that some people must wrestle with their own pride before they can hear a simple fact. And he hoped the road had been kind to him. The clock on the shelf moved its hands one small space, and Ben stood again to draw the curtains, then paused to straighten a frame on the bookshelf, the same frame that had tilted when Trevor struck the mantel days earlier, and he placed it square and let his fingers rest there a second longer than needed, as if telling the house that balance had returned. He turned off the lamp, walked to the bedroom, folded his suit over the chair, and set out a plain shirt for morning. And as he lay down, he felt the soft ache in his knees that always followed long days, and the quiet satisfaction that comes when gentleness holds. And the mystery left in the room was not whether he had been right. He had, but what shape tomorrow would take, now that a story had changed in the minds of people who mattered. Snow kept falling, and he slept knowing that Thursday would bring coffee, questions, and maybe the start of something new.